As our tale begins, an elderly countess returns home to the Hotel Cosmopolitan after a begrudged afternoon of Christmas-time shopping. Requiring fortification from her trying day, the servants prepare her tea and a hot bath. When suddenly, the countess is heard screaming violently through the halls of the palatial domicile. Rushing in, the servants find her clutching at an empty silver box, terrified and furious.
Lady?
Blue Carbuncle! Blue Carbuncle! Stolen!
And so begins the adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. Elsewhere, John Horner and his young wife window shop, seeking Christmas gifts for their 2 children, when Horner is abruptly apprehended by the police. Charged with the theft of the valuable gem, the Blue Carbuncle, he resists, and protesting his innocence, is carted off to prison as his wife weeps. At 221B, the street sweepers attend to their work, and Mrs. Hudson waves to Dr. Watson as he sets off to make a few of his own holiday preparations. But before she can close the door, the good housekeeper is accosted by a strange commissionaire holding a goose. In his book, A Study in Celluloid, producer Michael Cox recalled the lead-in to this episode. He wrote, "Nearly 14 minutes into the film, we arrive at Conan Doyle's starting point. But everything we've seen up to that point is implicit in the original story. The dramatist simply altered the structure and put some additional flesh on the bones. He did, however, make one significant change. Conan Doyle tells us very clearly the month and date of this case. The jewel was stolen on December 22nd, and Peterson discovered it in the crop of the goose on the 27th. It is, I believe, the only Christmas story in the canon, and we took full advantage of that by playing it a few days earlier. So the Countess, the Horners, and Dr. Watson have all been Christmas shopping." Back inside, Mrs. Hudson attempts to rouse her tenant.
Mr. Holmes! Mr. Peterson, the commissionaire from opposite.
Oh, please,
He'd like a word with you.
go away.
Holmes mashes a cigarette between his lips and fumbles for a match. But unable to locate one, he shambles into the sitting room, desperate for his morning nicotine fix, only to be met by Commissionaire Peterson. In his book, Bending the Willow, David Stewart Davies made the following observations. It was Brett who contributed the business concerning the first cigarette of the day. Holmes, dragged from his slumbers by Peterson the commissionaire, rushes into the sitting room for a match, nightshirt flapping. An inveterate smoker, Jeremy knew the pangs of the early morning cravings, knew that Holmes, also a tobacco addict, would feel them too, and translated them into his performance, the great sleuth panting for his first gasp of nicotine of the day. Thank goodness he never attempted to show Holmes smoking the first pipe of the day, which was made up of the plugs and dawdles on the mantelpiece, a revolting concept. Michael Cox also took note of Brett's choice here. He said, "We never managed to show the preparation of the disgusting before-breakfast pipe described in The Engineer's Thumb, but Jeremy Brett put his heart into this alternate piece of business."
I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Holmes.
Peterson, put down your goose. And your hat. It's a fine purchase. I myself favor a goose for Christmas dinner.
Well, that's part of the problem, Mr. Holmes. The bird is not mine. You might say I come by it.
For Mrs. Henry Baker, and obviously not your hat.
No, sir. Well, there were peculiar circumstances, and I didn't know what to do for the best. It hardly seemed to matter for the police. So I talked to the wife about it, and she suggests I'll come and see you.
Not the wise, Mrs. Peterson. Sit down, my dear fellow, and describe these peculiar circumstances to me.
Peterson explains that the previous night, after an evening of some small jollification, he came across a row that had broken out between a knot of young roughs and a drunken older man, who had a goose slung over his shoulder. Attempting to defend himself, the man's stick smashed the shop window behind him, and hearing the commissionaire calling out, all parties panicked and scattered, leaving behind a goose and the man's hat, which was knocked off in the scuffle. Unsure how to proceed, Peterson's wife recommended taking the matter to Holmes.
Now then, Commissionaire, have you purchased your own bird?
No, not yet. No.
Then I suggest that you carry off this goose so that it may fulfill its ultimate destiny, while I retain the battered hat of the unknown gentleman who has lost his Christmas dinner.
Well, if you think I should, Mr. Holmes.
I do indeed. For there are signs, in spite of the frost, that this bird should be prepared without unnecessary delay.
Well, if that's all right, Mr. Holmes.
I will, of course, keep you in touch with developments.
Very good, sir. Oh, may I wish you the compliments of the season?
And to you and your good wife.
Elsewhere, Inspector Bradstreet argues with the Countess, who is reluctant to offer any reward. But back at Baker Street, Watson returns from his shopping spree, surprised to find Holmes awake at so early an hour.
Holmes? Oh, you're up. The Countess of Morcar is offering £1,000 for the return of the Blue Carbuncle. Inspector Bradstreet of B Division is in charge of the case and has arrested Mr. John Horner, a plumber aged 36, who protested his innocence in the strongest terms. Circumstantial evidence was so strong that the case has been referred to the assizes. Horner, who showed signs of intense emotion during the proceedings, faded away at the conclusion and was carried from the court. Oh, excuse me, you are engaged. I am interrupting your study of that hat.
No. The matter is a perfectly trivial one. But there are points in connection with it which are not devoid of interest, even of instruction.
I suppose that, homely as it looks, that thing has some deadly story linked to it. That is the clue which will guide you in the solution of some mystery and the punishment of some crime.
No. It is just one of those whimsical little incidents that will occur when you have 4 million people all jostling each other within the space of a few square miles.
So what do you gather from that? Battered old felt.
You know my methods. What do you yourself gather as to the individuality of the man who has worn this particular article? It was accompanied by a goose, Watson. For Mrs. Henry Baker was printed upon a small card attached to the bird's left leg.
Well, apart from the initials inside, HB, presumably Henry Baker, I can see nothing.
On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. But you fail to reason from what you see. You are too timid in drawing your inferences.
Then, pray, tell me what it is that you can infer from that hat.
That the man is highly intellectual is, of course, obvious. And also that he was fairly well-to-do within the past 3 years, although now he has fallen upon evil days. He had foresight, but less now than formerly, pointing to a moral retrogression, which, when taken with a decline in his fortunes, seems to indicate an evil influence. Probably drink. This may account also for the fact that his wife has ceased to love him.
My dear Holmes.
He has, however, retained some degree of self-respect. Now, he leads a sedentary life. Is out of training entirely. Is middle-aged, has grizzled hair, which he has had cut within the last few days, and which he anoints with lime cream. It is also highly improbable that he has gas laid on in his house.
Well, now you are certainly joking.
Not in the least.
Well, I have no doubt that I'm very stupid. For example, how do you deduce that the man is intellectual?
It is a question of cubic capacity. A man with so large a head must have something in it.
Well, the decline in his fortunes, then?
These flat brims with the curled edges came in 3 years ago. It is a hat of the very best quality, Watson. Look at the band of ribbed silk and the excellent lining. If this man could afford so expensive a hat 3 years ago and has had no hat since, then he has assuredly gone down in the world.
What about the foresight? The moral retrogression?
Ah, here is the foresight. These securers are never sold upon hats. If this man ordered one, it is a sign of a certain amount of foresight, since he went out of his way to take precaution against the wind. But as you see that he has broken the elastic and has not troubled to replace it, a weakening nature. The further points that he is middle-aged, that his hair is grizzled, that it has been cut recently, and that he anoints it with lime cream can all be gathered by an inspection of the lower part of the lining, Watson, and witness the moisture. Obviously a free perspirer, therefore not in the best of training.
But his wife, you said she had ceased to love him.
This hat has not been brushed for weeks. When I see a man with a week's accumulation of dust upon his hat, and his wife has allowed him to go out in such a state, I fear that he has been unfortunate enough to lose his wife's affections.
But he might be a bachelor.
Nay, but he brought a goose as a peace offering to his wife. Remember the card attached to the bird's leg?
Yes. Well, you have an answer to everything. Just a minute. How do you deduce that there is no gas laid on in his house?
One tallow candle stain, or even two might come by chance, but when I see Watson, no less than 5. He never got candle stains from a gas jet, Watson. Are you satisfied?
This is one of the classic exchanges between Holmes and Watson, and Jeremy Brett and David Burke execute it flawlessly. But surprisingly, when interviewed in 1991, Jeremy Brett stated that this scene may have been the most difficult to film in the entire Granada series. To Jim Nush, he recalled, "That Sidney Paget drawing is so marvelous, with Holmes lying sideways on the sofa. I had to actually be in that position for about a day and a half, so I could very nearly not stand up straight at the end of shooting the scene. It was an undiluted piece of brilliant deduction, and one so invariably gets it wrong. But I remember thinking, that was a particularly tough film." As Watson reluctantly acknowledges the validity of Holmes' deductions, the door bursts open, and a flustered Peterson rushes inside.
Mr. Holmes, the goose. The goose, Mr. Holmes.
Well, what of it, man? Has it come back to life and flapped off through the kitchen window?
No, sir. But see what the wife found in its crop.
By Jove, Peterson. This is a treasure trove indeed. You know what you've got.
A diamond. Precious stone, but it cuts glass like it was putty.
It is more than a precious stone. It is the precious stone.
The Hotel Cosmopolitan robbery. The Blue Carbuncle.
The Blue Carbuncle indeed.
Peterson nearly faints when Holmes informs him that his reward of £1,000 would not even be within a 20th of the gem's value. The great detective is quick to enact a plan designed to trace the sequence of events leading from the theft to Mr. Henry Baker's goose. Holmes composes a note to be published in the evening papers.
Found. At the corner of Goodge Street, a goose and a black felt hat. Mr. Henry Baker can have same by applying at 6:30 this evening at 221B Baker Street. Clear and concise.
Yes, very, but will he see it?
Well, I'm sure he will keep an eye on the evening papers. For the poor man, the loss was a heavy one. Oh, Peterson. Just nip down to the advertising agency and have this put in all the evening papers.
Which one, sir?
The Globe, Star, Pall Mall, St. James Gazette, Echo, Evening News, Standard, and all the others that may occur to you.
Right away, sir. And the stone?
I shall keep the stone. Thank you, Peterson.
Yes, sir.
Holmes also requests that Peterson purchase a goose to replace the one that accompanied the hat. Elsewhere, inside the prison, Horner is questioned by an increasingly desperate Inspector Bradstreet.
Well, Horner, her ladyship is not at all pleased with me. You might be under lock and key, but she'd rather her Blue Carbuncle was.
Never took it, Inspector.
Yes.
What is it?
Well, tell me what you did with it, and I'll put in a good word at your trial. But if you don't...
I've been on the straight for years, ever since I married Jenny.
If you don't, and when the judge hears about your previous conviction, you might never see your pretty wife again. I've got you, Horner, but I need that jewel.
Inspector Bradstreet is portrayed here by actor Brian Miller, and while Bradstreet makes other appearances in the series, Miller does not. According to Michael Cox, by the time we reached The Man with the Twisted Lip, we had overlooked Bradstreet's previous appearance and cast Dennis Lill to fill the role moving forward. So this is Brian Miller's only episode, but I think he does a perfectly good job as the irritated Scotland Yard inspector. Later, at Baker Street, Holmes and Watson receive an answer to their advertisement. A Mr. Henry Baker joins them before their fire.
Mr. Baker. Is that your hat? Oh, yes. Oh, it is undoubtedly my hat. Thank you, sir. I would have advertised its loss, but shillings have not been so plentiful with me as they once were. I had no doubt that the gang of roughs who assaulted me had carried off both my hat and the bird. I did not care to spend more money in a hopeless attempt at recovering them. Yes, well, of course, that is very understandable. Oh, by the way, about your bird, we were compelled to eat it. To eat it? It would have been a little use to anyone had we not done so. But we have another goose upon the sideboard there, which I presume will answer your purpose equally well. It is about the same weight and perfectly fresh, as you can see. Oh, yes, most certainly. Of course, we have kept the feathers, legs, crop, and so on of your own bird, if you so wish. They might be useful to me as relics of my adventure, but beyond that, I can hardly see what use the disjecta membra of my old acquaintance could possibly be to me. Oh, no, sir, with your permission, I shall confine my attentions to the excellent bird which I perceive upon your sideboard. I would be interested to know where the other bird came from. You see, I am somewhat of a fowl fancier, and I have seldom seen a better-grown bird. It would be of great interest to me to know precisely how it came into your possession. It was the club, sir, the Goose Club. So, the Goose Club? What were the exact circumstances?
Mr. Baker explains that he frequents a public house known as the Alpha Inn, where the proprietor has instigated a goose club, whereby the payment of a few pence each week, contributors receive a bird at Christmas. Having collected his fowl and a few drinks, he set off home, but was accosted by a gang of ruffians and assumed that they had stolen his goose and hat. Producer Michael Cox was especially fond of these particular moments from the series. He said, "If I had to choose a favorite scene, I'd probably choose the one where Holmes examines Henry Baker's hat and does the whole deductive bit about Baker's wife ceasing to love him, and the fact that he hasn't got gas laid on in his house, and so on." In his book, he went on to recall, "Apart from giving Watson a greater share of the dialogue than Conan Doyle does, the scenes which follow were almost word for word as they were originally written. That certainly satisfied Jeremy's passion for total fidelity, but at the same time encouraged David Burke to give us a more than usually affable Watson. They also include an exemplary performance by Frank Middlemass, who seems to me to be the Henry Baker of everyone's imagination." As Baker finishes his tale, Holmes realizes that he can be of little further use, and they dismiss him, wishing him the season's greetings before setting out themselves to follow the trail of clues. From the proprietor of the Alpha Public House, they learn the name of the vendor who supplied the geese and make their way to Covent Garden to confront Breckenridge, the supplier. But when they find Breckenridge to be belligerent and unhelpful, Holmes decides to utilize a different approach.
Well, then, the bet's off.
What bet? Ah, what bet?
Well, I'm always ready to back my opinion in the matter of fowls. And I have a fiver with my friend here that the bird that I chose is country bred, right, Watson?
What? Oh, yes, absolutely.
Ah, you've lost your money then, because it's town bred.
It is nothing of the kind.
I say it is.
I don't believe you.
Come on, pay up, Holmes.
What do you think I wouldn't know, me who's been handling fowl since I was a nipper? I'll tell you, all the birds that went to the Alpha were town bred.
You'll never make me believe that.
Come on, do the decent, Holmes.
Will you have a bet, then?
Oh, we're just taking your money. But I'll have a sovereign with you just to teach you not to be obstinate.
Done!
Right. Now then, Mr. Cocksure, you see these here books here? Well, this is a list of all the folk what I buy off. Now, on this page, there's all me country folk. And these on this side in red ink are all me town suppliers. Now, you read out that third name down to me.
Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road.
Yeah, account number 249. Go on then, turn it up in the ledger.
Mrs. Oakshott, Egan, poultry supplier.
And what's the last entry?
24 geese at 7 and 6 pence. Sold to Mr. Windigate of the Alpha Public House.
So, what have you got to say now? What about this gentleman's fiver?
In A Study in Celluloid, Michael Cox admitted to the perpetuation of a canonical but geographical error in this part of the tale. He wrote, "On the trail of the goose, I'm afraid that we gave longer life to one of Conan Doyle's few mistakes about Victorian London. I now know that Breckenridge's stall should have been at Smithfield Market and not Covent Garden. But Tim Wilding created a splendid setting for us, and David Carson introduced it with a handsome crane shot. The little betting scam, which produces the necessary information about the source of the goose, is carried off with panache. By this time, however, the pace and momentum have increased, and my only regret is the immediate arrival of Ryder prevents Holmes from explaining to Watson how he recognized in Breckenridge a gambling man." After settling the bets, Holmes and Watson are about to depart when they spy a desperate-looking man also hassling Breckenridge about his stock. Holmes immediately recognizes what fortune has placed before them, and they pursue the squirrely man through the marketplace, eventually overtaking him.
Excuse me, but I could not help overhearing the conversation you had just now with that salesman. I think I can be of assistance to you in this matter.
You? Who are you?
My name is Sherlock Holmes. It is my business to know what other people don't know.
You can know nothing of this.
On the contrary, I know everything of it. I know that you are trying to find out the whereabouts of some geese sold by Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road to our friend, Mr. Breckenridge over there, who in turn sold them to Mr. Windigate of the Alpha Public House.
Sir, you're the very man I've longed to meet. I can hardly explain to you my interest in the matter.
Then I suggest that we carry on this conversation in rather more comfort.
Cab!
Together, they retire to Baker Street, where Holmes prepares to spring his trap.
I think we should know the name of the gentleman whom we have the pleasure of assisting, don't you, Watson?
John Robinson.
Oh, no. Your real name. It is so awkward doing business with an alias.
Well then, my real name's Ryder. James Ryder.
Yes, Mr. Ryder. Upper attendant at the Hotel Cosmopolitan.
Yes.
And I suppose you would like to know what happened to these geese. Or rather, one goose in particular. White with a grey head.
Oh, sir, can you tell me where it went to?
It came here.
Here?
Sadly, it is no longer here. But it laid an egg after it was dead. The bonniest, brightest little blue egg you have ever seen. Oh, I have it. Yeah.
With a sleight of hand, Holmes reaches into the gas lamp, from where he appears to retrieve the Blue Carbuncle. As he holds it up to the light, James Ryder grins at the sight of it and reaches out his hand, just as Holmes closes the trap.
The game's up, Ryder.
All of the color drains from Ryder's face, and Holmes catches him as his knees buckle under.
Bear up, man! You'll be in the fire. What a wretched little shrimp it is, to be sure. There's not enough blood in him for felony. I have almost every link in the chain, Ryder. You need tell me very little.
Catherine Cusack put me up to it.
Her ladyship's maid.
Exactly. You knew from local gossip that Horner had been concerned in some such matter before. So what did you do? You made some small job in my lady's room. You and your confederate Cusack. You then managed that Horner should be sent for. But you stole the jewel. Then you raised the alarm and had this unfortunate man arrested for some...
For God's sake, Mr. Holmes, have mercy. Think of my father, think of my mother, and break their hearts. I never went wrong before, I never will again, I swear it on the Bible. Oh, don't bring me to court, Mr. Holmes. For God's sake, don't do that to me.
Get back into your chair. It's very well to cringe and crawl now, but you thought little of the man that you sent to the dock for a crime of which he knew nothing.
I'll fly, Mr. Holmes. I'll leave the country. Then the charge against him will all break down.
We'll talk about that later. Now tell me, how came the stone into the goose? And how came the goose into the open market? Tell me the truth now, for that is your only hope of safety.
Ryder explains that he fled the scene of the crime, eager to find a hiding place for the stone, and ended up at his sister Maggie's house on Brixton Road. Maggie Oakshott, a breeder of geese, had promised him his choice of the stock for Christmas. But sitting alone with the birds, Ryder realized the answer to all of his problems. He carefully selected from the gaggle a goose with a distinctive gray head, and then proceeded to force the gemstone down its throat. But as his sister re-emerged, the bird broke loose and fluttered off among the others. Ryder nervously insisted that he take his bird home, so she gave him leave to kill it and take it as he left.
I did what she said, Mr. Holmes, and I carried the bird to my pal. We got a knife and we opened it up. My heart turned to water. There was no sign of the stone, and I knew some terrible mistake must have occurred.
Ryder raced back to his sister's house, but it was too late. There had been a second gray-headed goose, but all the Christmas geese had since been delivered to the dealers.
I ran as hard as my feet would carry me to this man Breckenridge, but he'd sold the lot, and not one word would he tell me as to where they'd gone. I thought I'd go mad, and now I'm a branded thief without ever having touched the wealth for which I sold my character. God help me. God help me.
Get out.
What? Heavens bless you, sir.
No more words. Get out.
Ryder quietly takes his hat and hurries away. Watson is shocked and helpless to intervene, and he watches the man from the window as he runs away down the street. Turning, he looks at his friend with disdain.
I must confess, Holmes, to being a little surprised.
I am not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies.
Maybe I am committing a felony, but I may be saving a soul. Send him to jail now, you make him a jailbird for life. Oh, listen, after all, it is the season for forgiveness. Come.
Midnight. Merry Christmas, Holmes.
And to you, my dear friend.
Just a minute. Holmes, I cannot contemplate eating while John Horner is still on remand. Now, do you suppose that Bradstreet or one of his colleagues might still be at their desks?
You're quite right, Watson. Come, let's go.
Michael Cox was quite pleased with the casting of this episode and had kind words for the actor portraying the villain. He wrote, "Ken Campbell gives an extraordinary, possessed performance as Ryder, making him one of Conan Doyle's most eccentric villains. One can well believe that this man would have chosen such a bizarre hiding place for his stolen goods. Holmes has no trouble in extracting a confession from this miserable creature, but then makes the surprising decision to release him without penalty. When Watson challenges this course of action, Holmes says that he is not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies, and Jeremy Brett gives the line a fiercely angry reading. For a moment here, we glimpse the demons that lie beneath the urbane exterior. But how on earth did Holmes return the jewel without explaining where it was found, extract Peterson's just reward, persuade the Countess not to press charges, and secure the release of Horner? Perhaps it is better not to ask too many questions, but simply be grateful that, in our version at least, Horner is reunited with his family on a white Christmas morning. Composer Patrick Gowers provided a uniquely memorable score for this installment, and in Granada's Greatest Detective, Keith Frankel perfectly encapsulated the achievement. He wrote, "Patrick Gowers turns in perhaps his most ornate score of the production's entire 10-year reign. There are far too many enterprising embellishments to list, but it would be remiss in this most Christmassy of adaptations not to draw attention to his masterful weaving of classical seasonal hymns into the program's main melodic fabric. Silent Night receives tender melancholy treatment and serves almost as a kind of signature theme for Henry Baker. But it is the chameleonic We Three Kings that shimmers most resplendently of all, being subjected to a triptych of permutations. We go from the off-kilter, almost kaleidoscopic strains of the Baker Street organ grinder, through the caterwauling clamor of the bazaar's local brass choir, to the buoyant, ringing renewal of the composer's very own ensemble, as things come full circle at the conclusion." I fully agree with Mr. Frankel's sentiments here, but let's dive a little deeper and get to know the composer himself, Mr. Patrick Gowers. Born in 1936 in Islington, he was the son of a solicitor, Richard Gowers, and his wife, Stella. His great-grandfather was the neurologist, Sir William Richard Gowers, and his grandfather was the writer, Sir Ernest Gowers. He was educated at Radley College and read music at Cambridge, where he taught composition part-time until completing his doctorate in 1966. From there, he was music director of the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat as performed by the inmates of the Asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, in both the West End and New York City productions. And he subsequently composed the music for the 1967 film version of that play. But in the 1970s, Gower turned his attention primarily to composing for film and television, and in 1982, he won the BAFTA for his work on Smiley's People, The Woman in White, and I Remember Nelson. But over the next decade, Gowers would devote himself and become inextricably linked to the Granada Sherlock Holmes television series. He would, single-handedly, create all the music to the complete 46-hour Granada program, collaborating with many world-class performing musicians, including guitarist John Williams, St. Paul's Cathedral Choir, and his own daughter, Catherine Gowers, an accomplished violinist, who played the lead in many of the series' most iconic pieces, including the main theme. From 1984 to 1994, Patrick Gowers' magnum opus would become ingrained in the hearts and minds of television audiences around the world. And for many Sherlock Holmes fans, his work would forever be the music to accompany the adventures of the great detective. In 1998, Gowers retired from show business and devoted his energies to the Association of Professional Composers, working to improve the lot of young musicians. He then became a director of the Performing Rights Society, where, according to his Guardian obituary, his intellect and ingrained sense of justice ruffled feathers, but brought welcome changes. To those who did not know him, Patrick could appear somewhat aloof, but to those who did, you could not find a more kindly, sympathetic soul. William Patrick Gowers died on December 30th, 2014, at the age of 78. First broadcast on the ITV network on June 5th, 1984 at 9 p.m. Directed by David Carson and dramatized by Paul Finney. Now, if the name Paul Finney doesn't seem to ring any bells, it's likely because the man never existed. In A Study in Celluloid, Michael Cox explains. The name conceals the identity of another writer who disagreed with one or two changes that John had made in the draft script and chose to remove his name from it. I cannot now remember what the changes were and find it hard to believe they were very damaging, but lines of battle were drawn, and this was the result. In Granada's Greatest Detective, Keith Frankel offers up a possible solution to the mystery of the unnamed screenwriter. He writes, "Here we move into the realms of conjecture, but in the year prior to the Blue Carbuncle's broadcast in March 1983, Television Today ran a feature on its production and listed playwright Richard Harris as the person responsible for adapting this entry. The precise reasons for his withdrawal from the project are still somewhat obscure, but in spite of making considerable efforts to find common ground, each party stood firm, resulting in Harris's refusal to permit Granada the use of his name upon the screenplay. Hence, Paul Finney was born." Now, director David Carson got his start in the British theater scene, but quickly made the transition to television. The Blue Carbuncle was one of his first jobs in the director's chair, and he quickly impressed the show's producers with his sense of style. In A Study in Celluloid, Michael Cox remembered. Carson, a director new to the series, brought an imaginative flourish to the opening title sequence. Brief glimpses of the Carbuncle's sinister history are framed in the jewel itself, and the last of these is the presentation of the gem to the young countess. The first shot of the film proper shows the same character in later life, and clearly the gift has not brought her happiness. But Carson longed for Hollywood, and soon made the move to America, where his agent arranged him an interview with the producers of a little show called Star Trek: The Next Generation. But Carson, having never heard of Star Trek, found that he needed to quickly research the program, so he rented some videos and crammed prior to his interview. The producers relished his British style and unique take on scene blocking, and he got the job. establishing himself as a bona fide Hollywood television director. His career, which would follow, was nothing short of impressive, as Carson would go on to direct countless top-tier shows and films, everything from Coronation Street to Smallville. And his stint in the Star Trek universe was far from over, as he would direct numerous installments of the different Trek franchises, including one of the most beloved episodes of The Next Generation, Yesterday's Enterprise, which positioned him to helm the watershed film, Star Trek Generations, a film in which his spouse, Kim Braden, played a cameo as Captain Picard's alternate reality wife. Carson would go on to direct some of the Granada series' very best episodes, including The Resident Patient, The Six Napoleons, and The Musgrave Ritual, cementing him, I think, as series royalty. The Blue Carbuncle was shown in Britain unseasonably in June of 1984, and sadly has never been a Christmas repeat. In Bending the Willow, David Stewart Davies goes on to reflect, 7 good shows and true. Sherlockians and critics were well satisfied. But while viewers had to wait 13 months until the next series, there was no real break in the filming schedule. The first 13 were shot, one after another. This was, of course, a punishing schedule for the regulars, especially David Burke and Jeremy Brett. However, it was not as arduous as it could have been, thanks to Brett's earlier request for more rehearsal time. So, as the first season comes to a close, let's reflect as we're joined by my co-host, Luke. On the goose left behind, fat and fine, the Peterson family may dine. But they find a large jewel. But can Sherlock be cruel? It's Yule. To forgive is divine. A Sherlockian Limerick by Isaac Asimov. So I mentioned earlier that this episode ran unseasonably in June of 1984, but the story also wasn't released right at Christmas time, actually originally published in the Strand in January of 1892, but in America, in the New York Strand, it didn't get published till February, so still in the season. And I mentioned, I think in one of the first episodes we did, I mentioned it, but I'll say it again here because it's time. In the U.S., the story was actually titled The Christmas Goose That Swallowed a Diamond, which I think is great. I'm going to try and track that down so I can have my own copy of that one. So I'll start it with a question for you. When I saw this episode when I was young, I always assumed that Holmes kept the gem.
Yeah.
Because he says, I shall keep it in my museum. I thought he meant forever.
Me too.
Yeah. It never made sense to me, though, because how could he still get Horner released if he kept the gem?
Right. Well, I don't know. But that's definitely what it seems like in the TV show.
Right.
But I think, if I remember correctly, he does say he got the stone out of his museum to show it to Ryder.
Yeah, to Ryder, yeah. And then the story kind of ends, so we don't know exactly what happens with it. But
maybe it's just a different kind of use of the word.
Yeah, and there's a lot of notes in the annotated books about money in this story.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, he pays out a lot of money in this one. He pays a sovereign to Breckenridge, and then it looks like a sovereign to the landlord of the public house. He pays for all the ads to be placed in the evening papers. He
doesn't give him any money. He just says place all the ads.
Yeah, but it's kind of assumed that that probably cost a little bit to place an ad in every paper.
Yeah.
And then he pays for the replacement goose for Henry Baker. And if you count the $5 that he gives to Watson,
he gets it right back.
He gets it right back.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of money, and those sovereigns aren't nothing.
Yeah.
Unanswered questions. I'm gonna look for the gem in his museum moving forward, but I'm gonna assume he returned it.
Yeah.
So all the actors in this episode are basically fantastic, but I was looking over all their IMDb credits, and I mean every single one of them has around 100, or more credits, but they all kind of seem to have the same, career trajectory, a lot of the same appearances in standard British shows. And since there were just so many of them, I mean there's Ryder, Henry Baker, Bradstreet, Horner, Mrs. Horner, the Countess, Mrs. Oakshott,
Breckenridge.
Yeah, Breckenridge. They all kind of have almost the same size part. So I kind of just, in the podcast, I just decided not.
And can't cover everybody.
Yeah. I kind of want to just relegate them to our little conversation here and make sure that they were all top notch, deserving of note. But there's just a lot of actors in this one, so I just wanted to make sure we gave them all their due. Well, I guess let's just start at the beginning on this one. One thing I noticed in just my most recent viewings of it that I never caught before, which I always try to find something new, is that organ grinder at the very beginning.
Hurdy-gurdy?
Yeah, I mean, like I'd heard it, I'd heard the music every time I watched it, but those kids, they don't show it very clearly because the camera's moving with everything and you don't really see it very well. But yeah, there's like a
street sweeper and then a hurdy-gurdy on wheels.
Yeah.
I put that down too, but just before that, one thing I noticed, when they're going through the history of the stone, and it's, they find it and somebody gets stabbed in bed and this and that. One guy's just stabbed when he's walking down the street with it in his pocket.
Yeah.
Seems a little careless.
Yeah, that's true.
But I guess you need it quick for TV.
Yeah. Speaking of stabs, I actually made a note in this one. This is a really good episode if you want to check out all the daggers on the walls of Baker Street.
Yeah.
There's at least 5 that you can see very clearly in this episode. Antique ceremonial daggers that they just have hanging in Baker Street. But I don't know why, but they always seem to be in the shot in this one. So I made a note of it.
Yeah. I was making notes. There's not very many. I mean, maybe just 2, but I was making notes about the captions in this one because I watched with captions.
Yeah.
And when the Duchess finds the stone missing, in the captions, she says the carbuncle. She goes, the carbuncle. But in the captions, it just says, no carbuncle.
Oh, really? I thought she went, the Blue Carbuncle.
Yeah. It sounds like something like that, but in the captions, it just says, no carbuncle.
Oh, interesting.
Which I thought was kind of a funny distinction.
It's hard to pull quotes from this one. I mean, again, like every line is kind of basically fantastic. But it is interesting that Holmes, his emotions really run the full gamut in this one.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think maybe the happiest we ever see him.
And the most dejected.
And the most angry. Yeah. And the most frustrated and kind of like sickened with society and really emotional episode. But on the happy spectrum, I think it's almost over the top in the moment where he says, and to you and your good wife.
And he's laughing with Watson.
Yeah.
At the market. No, it's a dang good episode.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of interesting inflection on certain words from a number of different people.
Yeah.
Like, I came across what can only be described as a fracas.
Yeah, that's a good one. And also Henry Baker's to eat it.
Yeah.
That's kind of a weird way to, I mean, wow, he was really upset about that.
Anytime Sherlock says goose.
Yeah.
It's fun.
There's a number of characters in here that it's because it's Christmassy. I feel like everything kind of flies and it works, but there's some cartoony people in here. Breckenridge.
I like him though.
I do like him, but it's if you close your eyes and listen, it almost seems like you're watching a cartoon from
stereotype. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to tell you so now.
Yeah. Well, some of that was in the book.
It is in the book,
but. The one that wasn't in the book that I wrote down, which was, see these here books here? Well, this is a list of all the folks of what I buy off.
Yeah. It's a thick accent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people in England are having a good time with that.
Yeah, sure. The guy at the Alpha Inn is also pretty cartoony. I mean, just kind of how he looks. I had gotten up to get a drink or something, and I paused it when he was smiling at Holmes when he says, well, bless you for a gentleman.
Yeah.
And he's just got this big grin. He looks like an overgrown hobbit or something. He's just got a very friendly eyeballs. Face. Yeah. But fun. He's good. I like him.
Big chops and everything.
But yeah, another good detail there on the when they're at Breckenridge's. I'm sure you noticed it, but the newspaper in his pocket.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever noticed that until this viewing.
I didn't either.
Yeah, the sporting section of the newspaper, which I know in the books, Michael Cox mentioned that they were sad that they didn't ever get to explain how Holmes knew to make that he was a betting man. They just didn't have time to shoot that explanation.
Yeah, but I think that's one of those things you didn't really need to do.
You're right, and I went a long time without noticing it, but
it's
seeing
a good,
that paper,
it's a good touch.
Yeah, I don't think people could have really made that out before high definition, though. So,
right. I mean, it says sporting. You can just see sporting folded up, and it's slightly pink. But in the story, Holmes refers to it as a pinkin.
Yeah.
And it says it's a sporting journal printed on pink paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like again, it's just. If you knew, it's cool that it's there.
Yeah, and if you're from that part of the world, you probably recognized it even if it wasn't in high def.
Right.
You know what I mean? But
I also like the fact that they put a goose feather in his hat.
Oh, yeah, right.
That was kind of nice.
Yeah.
Speaking of hats, there's a lot of hat controversy in the annotations of the Baring Gould book. Well, one thing I noticed about the bowler, I assume it's a Christie's bowler because of the red velvet interior. And then reading in the story, they definitely said it is red, so I thought that was curious. But they specifically said there was no name or brand listed on it. But a lot of annotations about, let's say, presumptions about hat etiquette.
Yeah.
And just dismantling of Sherlock's deduction.
Oh, right.
About all the care for the hat. You know, how a wife back then, for some reason, wouldn't care if you had dust on your hat.
Yeah, exactly.
But things like the securer, they're like, no, he probably got talked into that anyway. Doesn't mean he cared.
Yeah.
And if it broke, who cares? Nobody cares about those things anyway. But like, I have those kind of securers on all my hats because they're cool.
Yeah.
And I think if somebody had that, it is something you put on most times.
Yeah. I had a friend when I was growing up, and I made him watch the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes series, and it was my friend Andy. And one day his dad came in and said, you shouldn't believe anything Sherlock Holmes says because it's written as a trick. And Arthur Conan Doyle worked out all the answers and then worked backwards to provide the deductions. And even at the time, I remember thinking, well, of course he did. He's a writer.
Well, yeah.
But it doesn't change the fact that it's great.
Right.
But at the same time, I feel like that's what a lot of these people in the books who try to criticize Holmes's deductions, that's what they're doing. You know what I mean? It's like, of course, it could mean more than one thing. I mean, Mrs. Henry Baker could be his mom. There's a note in one of the books that says, we have no way of knowing,
But it's kind of like, but they did cite a couple other situations where initials didn't match the person who you thought it was.
Right.
Sure. But HB and Mrs. Henry Baker on just some random guy in the street, it wasn't meant to be a big mystery that you had to crack.
I think the thing that Holmes says that solves all these problems is he goes, you're too timid in inferring your deductions, or whatever he says.
Yeah.
It's like, that's why he wins, because he's willing to be bold with his deductions, and they don't always pay off, but most of the time they do.
I never guess.
Yeah, exactly.
What's the other quote from Red-Headed League? Omne ignotum pro magnifico.
Yeah.
Everything is perfectly clear when it's explained to you.
Yeah.
But there's just tons and tons of annotations in this one, and most of it's about how specifically Sherlock is wrong about something, not Doyle.
Right.
Which I thought was kind of interesting. But also but a lot about this hat.
Yeah. I feel like if you were to pause the show, the Blu-ray HD version, you might be able to make out some kind of brand or maker's mark of that hat, but I don't think I did.
No, but it's hard to tell exactly, but the Christie's bowler hats are red, and they have a certain like folding of the velvet inside. So I'm pretty sure it's a Christie's hat.
The first hat I ever bought was a Christie's.
Yeah, I still don't own a Christie's hat, but I want one.
Yeah.
The one quote that I love of the hat during the hat deduction is, "Witness the moisture."
Yeah.
Which isn't in this story, but I think it's just a great line.
Yeah. And clearly a free perspirer and not in the best of... Yeah.
Yeah.
It took again, when I was young, I didn't understand what he was saying. Clearly a free perspirer and not in the best of shape or whatever he says,
Which then, again, somebody says, everybody sweats. It doesn't tell you anything.
Right, exactly.
Like, okay.
Yeah.
Just nitpicking.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about the nitpicking that goes on in the annotated books, then it's probably worth mentioning, I'm sure both books have a ton of stuff about the carbuncle and how it's a garnet. And they come in many colors: white, yellow, green, red, orange, brown, purple, and black, but no blue.
The carbuncle is a garnet. But
right.
The blue carbuncle is not a garnet.
Well...
Or it's just what they're calling it.
But that's why it's magical for the story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. But another note from the books, almost all rare stones will cut glass. Sapphires, garnets, beryls, pretty much everything will cut, even tempered glass will cut glass. So it's not much of a test, but one thing that is true is that only diamonds are made of crystallized charcoal, so Holmes was definitely wrong to say that.
Right, but then they speculated that it might just be a blue diamond.
Yeah.
So, and again, I think there's a lot of colloquial phrases that Holmes uses, and he's not necessarily like a gem.
Right. If you don't want to take every detail to task, then you can just assume that at the time they called it the Blue Carbuncle.
Yeah.
And whether it was a carbuncle or not, who knows? But
crystallized carbon just sounds nice.
Sure.
More than, what do they call it? They say something about magnesium and all the different elements. It's like, that doesn't work as well in a story.
Another detail everybody nitpicks on is the fact that a goose actually has no crop. Did they mention that in your book?
Yeah.
It's a little detail.
That's another, again, like, I mean...
Yeah, if you're using crop colloquially,
it's the
it's his innards, it's guts, whatever. Yeah.
And it's the commissionaire that says it.
Yeah.
And then they just keep using it. So I feel like, I don't know. Yeah. I feel like we're just looking for things to hate in these stories.
Yeah, exactly. Well, getting back to the actual show, there are a lot of good things to look at in this one. For Uber fans like us, there's some really good images of his magnifying glass.
Right.
Which, again, is something I've been seeking the exact magnifying glass that he has on eBay for a long time. It's not a cheap one to find, and it's hard to find in good condition and it's rare when they do pop up.
There's a good shot of the frame around the Falls and Reichenbach photo.
There's a moment when it's a really wide shot, and there's something red hanging down at the top of the frame. I couldn't tell.
I think it might be a Christmas wreath.
Maybe.
I don't think they ever cut wide. I wasn't really paying attention.
It's really high in the room. It would seem weird that they would put a prop up there.
Well, but they do, when people are in mourning, they'll put like a...
Yeah.
It could be something like that.
It's possible. But
the fact that it was red, I thought it was a Christmas theme thing.
It's possible. It's just really, really high.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they ever show the entire picture in the show. I'm not sure.
I don't remember. Another thing to just look for that is funny, when he's shoving the commissionaire out the door.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's meant to be on purpose, but he actually shuts the door on his foot.
Oh, he does?
On the actor's foot. Yeah, you can hear it, but I ran it back and watched it. He's just kind of clobbering him out the door. I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah. I mean, when you're on a TV schedule, sometimes you just got to go with stuff like that. But there is another one I wanted to ask you what you thought of this. So when Ryder is putting the stone in the bird's mouth, I'm sure you looked at this.
Yep.
What it looks like is that he just literally drops it out of his hand into his other hand and catches it, and you can actually hear it falling into his hand. But I frame by framed it, and I couldn't really see it, like, unless they got really lucky and it was just like in the shadow of that piece of the shot, or they did something to remove it. I mean, when something falls, it's only a frame,
right?
Or so.
I don't think they did. I think it was just luck, because you can see him positioning. It's a little bit of sleight of hand.
Yeah.
And he really has to pry the mouth open, though, which is kind of awkward.
Yeah.
And he puts it in there, but then he just kind of wiggles it to the side, and then you can see him his left hand grab it. There's also a part where Holmes is showing the stone up against the lamp.
Yeah, and he's doing his sleight of hand.
He's doing his sleight, but they cut away from it.
Yeah. Maybe it just didn't come off very well.
I guess.
But yeah, that's not in the story either.
Yeah.
But I love that addition. But I just thought that part with Ryder was interesting because, I mean, it seems like if that was their whole plan for that effect, like we're just going to drop it. Don't worry about it. And maybe they were like, we'll cut away if it doesn't look good or something. Or maybe they were like, people are going to be so focused on that goose having its mouth, pulled open.
I've seen it a lot, and I don't notice it. I notice it after the fact.
But I mean, even when you're looking for it, you don't really see the gem fall.
No, I know.
It's so weird. It makes me wonder if they like cleaned it up or something, just for a frame or two.
They could have for the Blu-ray or something.
Yeah,
but I mean, they didn't take the strings out of the final problem of the dummies falling.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
yeah.
Or the actors falling, rather.
Yeah. Well, one of maybe my single favorite line of the entire Jeremy Brett series is in this episode. And There's a couple, if I asked you to guess, that you might guess, but it's the line where he says, "But you have thought little of the man who you sent to the dock for a crime of which he knew nothing."
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's probably my favorite line.
Yeah.
Of Jeremy Brett in the entire series. He's just so great in that moment.
I mean, one of my favorites is still the Witness the Moisture.
Yeah.
But there's like, classic lines in it too when he says, "My name is Sherlock Holmes. It's my business to know what others do not know."
Yeah, I mean, and again, if we're kind of skipping to the best Jeremy moments, then I would say that the gestures that he gives when he's trying to get rid of Henry Baker, he can't really. It's just looks, so he can't really recreate it with words. But when he's just kind of sick of him, and it's just get him out of here, Watson.
Yeah,
he's pretty dismissive.
Yeah.
Of Henry Baker in that moment, but it's funny to watch.
Come, draw near the fire.
Yeah,
his hands moving.
Yeah.
Also, there's just the way they leer at Henry Baker. They both like sit in the chair next to each other.
Yeah.
And just watching him.
I like that though, because it's like at that moment they don't know if he's the criminal or not.
Right.
So they're kind of luring him into their trap and listening to him. But Michael Cox says in his books and in his notes that he was really happy with Frank Middlemess, the guy who plays Henry Baker, and says that he thought that he was kind of like the Henry Baker that everyone saw in their imagination. And definitely not the Henry Baker I saw in my imagination when I read that story, especially with the Strand illustration. Doesn't really look anything like him. But I love that guy. I think he's. I mean, I'm happy to change my imagination to fit Frank Middlemess moving forward because I think he's great.
Yeah. Well, he's my image. I think he's a gem.
Yeah. To eat it. That's a great line.
Disjecta-membra.
Yeah. He's that ruddy complexion and everything is just he was great. So the writer Paul Finney is actually not a real person because the actual writer or the person who it's speculated is the actual writer of this episode, Richard Harris, wanted his name taken off of it. And that's kind of, I think, as far as I can tell, the only person who has kind of put those pieces together and deduced that is Keith Frankel, author of Granada's Greatest Detective. And I don't know how he talks about how he put the pieces together. There was, a morning show in England where they were talking behind the scenes, of the making of that episode, and they mentioned Richard Harris. But then when the episode finally came out, it says Paul Finney. And then later on, Michael Cox explains that the writer changed his name, didn't want his name on it or whatever. But I just think it's interesting because Richard Harris comes back for the Norwood Builder. So he did write the script on that one and he did keep his name on that one. I don't know, maybe they kissed and made up and everything was fine. I don't know. It's a good episode. I mean, they must have come to some real disagreements if it was to the point where he had to take his name off of it. I mean, it's not like it's embarrassingly bad.
That is kind of weird. I mean, I would say it's a really good episode. I don't know why you would want your name taken off it, but I mean...
Well, it's also, other than 2 parts, it's almost exactly from the book. So, I don't know. What could he complain about, One piece of trivia, I think it's in the Klinger book, is that Holmes actually frees the guilty party in 14 total of his cases.
Right.
14...
14
times he does that. It seems like a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in this one, he says, may have committed a felony, but I probably saved his soul.
Yeah.
And, I guess he's got scruples at least.
Yeah, I mean, at Christmas time, it makes a little sense, but...
Sure.
Other times,
Yeah, but I mean...
Commuting other people's sentences.
Yeah. There was actually a whole annotation about the word commute.
Yeah.
Or commit
yeah.
also.
Yeah.
I don't know. There were some weird annotations.
Yeah, I think I have the similar thing because if you're commuting a sentence, you could only do that if you were like of royal descendancy or something. And so people are like, is Holmes tipping his hand here? Is he related to the king?
Right.
It's like, okay.
But it's like he didn't commit it, so maybe he commuted it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think he's just using a word.
Yeah.
Well, let's get to the Persian slippers. Would you like to be the first to vote?
Sure. I really like this episode.
Yeah.
When I think back on it, though, when I think about the mystery, it's not an amazing mystery, but like I love this episode. I love watching it, and I love the actors and the performances.
Yeah.
And so I think I would give it 10 slippers plus however big the crop of a fowl is. Extra.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I just have to agree. I'm giving it 10. I think the thing I really like most about this episode is it's Holmes and Watson. There's not really a Violet Smith that comes in, or a Violet Hunter or any other Violets. It's just
Strayed.
Yeah, it's Holmes giving a piece of solid deduction based on the hat, and the goose, and following it up, from zero, and
Right.
just I like that. I think it's maybe the only story of that kind in the canon that's, well, certainly the only one that also has a Christmas time motif going on. But I don't know. I just think it all really works. And honestly, there's so many great lines. Every word that comes out of Holmes's mouth, that from the beginning when he wakes up and he's like, "Oh, leave me alone, go away," and he's like, she's waking him up out of the bed and he's looking for a cigarette, and
I'm not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies.
Yeah, that's again another one, maybe my second favorite line in the entire canon. Although I will say this, the very last line of the story.
If you will have the goodness to touch the bell, Doctor, we will begin another investigation in which also a bird will be the chief feature.
Yeah. They should have left that line in the show. That's a great little line.
Yeah.
Even if then they went, wait a minute, Holmes, I can't eat
Sure.
knowing that James Horner's on remand. I mean, it's just such a great line. But honestly, I think it really is, it's one of the best. It's a classic episode. Well, we've had a number of emails. I thought we'd just read a couple of them really quick. Listener by the name of John Cox wrote in and said, "I've loved the Granada series since I first watched them on Mystery back in the 80s. I frequently break out my DVD box set and rewatch them all. Watching the Blue Carbuncle is a Christmas Eve tradition." I try and do that as well, but I feel like almost very rarely does a year go by where I haven't watched it during the year, so sometimes I feel like I might have just watched it before Christmas time.
Well, after I watched The Speckled Man for the episode, we just kept watching them.
Yeah.
So I just watched this one, and then I watched it again just to be ready for this.
Yeah. Michael wrote in to say, "Just listened to the Scandal in Bohemia episode. I really enjoyed the discussion by the two of you. It really lets me think about the episodes from a different perspective, as all my friends I ever told about the series were not too keen on watching something that is older than themselves. For example, The Mask of the King is something I thought about too when I was watching the episode for the first time, but I could not validate if other people thought about it the same way." So, kind of cool.
What was he thinking about it?
I don't know. I think he just...
the silliness of the
Yeah,
mask?
I think he was just reflecting
or the
on...
sound effect that it makes.
Just kind of like how ridiculous it was that it wouldn't hide his identity.
Yeah.
He also says, on another note regarding Irene Adler's name, or rather the pronunciation of it, I uploaded some parts of the German version of the series on YouTube where you can hear the German pronunciation. And he gave me a link, but you can find it just by looking up Sherlock Holmes Scan 5, Irene Adler. He says, in newer adaptations, even the German translation uses the British pronunciation, though. But yeah, I looked at his link, and it's how they say it in the episode. It's
Irena
Adler. Yeah.
I guess I just don't know why Watson would say Irena.
I think, again, it's when the king comes in, he says it first, and he has the accent. And so I think rather than have the episode be inconsistent...
I guess that's true, because no one calls Ralph Fiennes Ralph Fiennes.
Ralph Fiennes?
No.
Yeah.
So once you hear that this is how my name is pronounced, you just say it that way.
Right,
So
yeah.
I guess that makes sense.
Well, a good friend of the show, Karen, from brettholmes.tumblr.com, wrote in. She said, just wanted to share a couple thoughts and fun facts. In the Crooked Man podcast, I recall Luke saying something about being excited about the episode, but only because he confused it with The Man with the Twisted Lip, which he really enjoys, and I had to laugh because I've done this half a dozen times myself. I love The Man with the Twisted Lip. She says, I love when you bring up the Deerstalker. I cannot stress my appreciation to the Granada costume crew enough for not dressing Holmes up in the Inverness cape and Deerstalker every episode and reserving that for Holmes' excursions into the countryside. Yeah, we've mentioned that, which, it's...
the costume department is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, and the just the selection of hats and like the kind of justifications for outfits, I think it's great.
Yeah, I feel like as the show goes on, it settles into kind of some standard outfits, but in the first couple seasons, it's better.
I'm still waiting for the appearance of the Homburg.
Yeah. I think my favorite hat moment in the entire series is in The Devil's Foot when Holmes has his scarf wrapped around his hat.
Yeah.
She goes on to say, side note, like you, I was also confused for some time about the name of the shell house where Holmes and Watson awaited Miss Stoner's signal, but then I noticed there are seashells embedded into the walls and windowsills of that little cottage. Yeah, I never had noticed that until she mentioned it.
No.
She continues, I have a fun fact for you. Patrick Gowers' daughter is the violin player on the main theme for the show. If you listen to the original airings in the first episode, the violin's a little scratchy, a little rough. But if you watch a later episode, such as The Empty House or similar, you'll hear that the theme was re-recorded as his daughter became more proficient and practiced. I thought that was really neat. I also recall reading or hearing somewhere that the same daughter played the track listed as The Death of Sherlock Holmes at Jeremy Brett's memorial. I thought this was very touching.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mentioned some of that earlier in the episode.
I bought a violin just to learn how to play that theme song, and I can do it terribly, but I can only play that, and Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Nice. Yeah, we'll talk more about the music, I think, as the episodes go on, because, in fact, as the shows progress, there comes a point where there are many episodes in a row where I am pretty sure that the theme song is different each time it's played. I think they re-recorded it for like every episode for a while.
Every episode, you think?
Just about.
Okay.
It's so subtly different. You have to be a lunatic fan like we are to notice it. But unless it's just mixed differently, which is possible.
That's possible.
There are some where you can hear that, different pieces of the music are different.
And there's little scrapes.
Yeah, but there's definitely multiple versions of the theme.
Yeah, I thought maybe it was changing on the different series. Or I didn't really ever sit down and try to think about which episodes it was.
I went on a binge at one point and really noticed it. Hearing them multiple ones in the same day. But yeah, we'll examine that a little more closely when we get to it.
Obviously the final problem, the music is quite a bit darker.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. And she finishes up by saying, I started featuring and posting along with your podcast through my Tumblr account, and I've been rating my own Persian slippers. So thank you for giving me an excuse to watch and review the episodes again. So
cool. Right on.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Another good friend of the show, Jane, says, OMG, I cannot tell you how much I loved hearing The Crooked Man. The acting that Norman Jones as the Crooked Man does is some of the greatest I've ever seen. By the way, I'm in total agreement how wonderful it is to watch Jeremy at the beginning when he's young and happy, which is why I cannot wait until you do the Red-Headed League. Jeremy is at the top of his league in this performance. I have watched over and over the great piece where he and Watson are in the barbershop and Watson is so thrilled when Sherlock looks at him with a half smile to let his friend know that he was somewhat correct on why Sherlock had traveled with Watson to get his hair cut. Jeremy's ability to show the good, the bad, and sadly the ugly about Sherlock is why I can watch the Granada series over and over. Fondly, Jane.
It's a great episode.
Yeah.
It's another classic.
There's so many great episodes.
And just another weird story. I mean, another weird mystery to have to solve.
Yeah. So, one last email from Jim. He says, Dear Gus and Luke, I first fell in love with Sherlock Holmes when my father lent me his copy of the casebook when I was a mere slip of a lad. My love for the stories became an obsession when the two of us sat down to watch the Granada series together, and I have never stopped watching or enjoying them ever since. My father's favorite thing about the program was the camera work, and he would be delighted whenever a mirror was used in a shot. And once you start noticing the use of mirrors and reflections, they're everywhere. Masterful stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There's so many cool shots. We start getting into that soon, too.
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of shots in the mirrors. I mean, Speckled Ben had them,
yeah,
for sure. But later on, they're all over, like shooting through colored glass and mirrors and things. It's so fun and so interesting.
Yeah, no, it is good. He goes on to say, my proudest moment as a Brett fan came when I signed the petition to get him awarded a posthumous BAFTA. I work at the British Museum, and my email was noticed by the good folk organizing the petition, and they contacted me to ask a favor. There were plenty of signatures from the industry, and they wanted to have a few representatives from other sectors, and thought someone from the British Museum would add some gravitas. So I was asked to write a short piece about what Jeremy Brett meant to me to add to the covering letter to BAFTA. I was joined in my words by those from Edward Hardwicke, Roy Hudd, Stephen Fry, and others, and I was very proud indeed, despite our best efforts failing and no such BAFTA being awarded. Anyway, enough from me for now. I have an excellent podcast to listen to. Thanks again, Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Well, this is the last episode of the first season of the show. So we've made it to the end of season 1, technically.
Hooray.
Series 1. And we'll be starting on series 2 shortly with the Copper Beaches. But I don't know, all in all, I think it's hard to say if this is the very best season of the series.
Yeah.
The next one is pretty dang good, too.
I got some good ones coming up.
Yeah. But I don't know. I saw a poll online recently where people were voting whether it was Jeremy Brett and David Burke or Jeremy Brett and Edward Hardwicke was the best Holmes-Watson pairing of all time.
That's a good problem to have.
I mean, I read some of the comments and people were really struggling to choose, and a lot of people were like, well, I saw the show for the first time with Edward Hardwicke, so I'm voting for him. Or that there were just more episodes with Edward Hardwicke, so they're voting for him.
Yeah.
I love Edward Hardwicke, but I just got to say, I think that David Burke is always going to be my favorite Watson.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to watch them again and get to that point where we switch over to Edward Hardwicke, because I'm older now. Maybe I'll find myself surprised. Maybe I'll love Hardwicke even more than I ever did before. But I don't know. I've always thought that David Burke was the best, and I'm sticking to it for now.
Me too. But I will say, if you don't binge watch them, it's not quite as jarring of a transition.
Yeah.
Especially when you think of how many years are supposed to have passed in between, and Watson would have been in mourning, and it's good.
I'm sure we'll say all this again when we get to that episode, The Empty House. But that first one with Edward Hardwicke, he looks significantly like younger than he does in almost any future episode. It's almost like they gave him some color in his hair.
Yeah.
So the transition from David Burke to Edward Hardwicke, it's not terrible.
No.
When you have that very first episode, but then I feel like very quickly it changes and gets he's just a more somber kind of Watson.
Yeah.
But
yeah. But and that poll that you referenced, it was like 49-51.
Yeah.
So
it's close.
We're doing all right.
Yeah, I really wanted David Burke to win, but I don't think he did.
He wins here.
I know. I reached out to his agent again to see if maybe we could interview him while we're out there, but
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Okay, well, we've made it to the end of season 1, but there are still so many fantastic episodes ahead. Please remember to like and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter at twitter.com/SherlockPod. And if you'd like to share your thoughts about any of the shows we've covered, please drop us a line at contact@SherlockPodcast.com. And if you'd like to help us keep the show going, we have a Patreon account where we've just posted a little bonus video, a quick examination of Gemma Jones' book, Jeremy Brett, Playing a Part. Just something we thought fellow fans of Jeremy Brett would enjoy. But planning to post more videos soon at patreon.com/SherlockPodcast. And as always, we really appreciate all of our new friends, followers, and subscribers out there. Philip, Jim, Oliver, Lucas, Donovan, Magical Boy 2000, Cali Girl, MX Publishing, Gretchen, Doug, Mike, Michael, Caroline, the Sherlock Holmes Society in St. Charles, Jordan, Paul, Phil, Anthony, John, He Dead, and Severian 24. Thanks, you guys, for listening. And thanks to everyone out there who's continuing to follow the show. Next, we dive into the second series with the Copper Beeches. Until then.